Jason had always prided himself on being independent, self-sufficient, but lately, the weight of his job had started to take its toll. The constant pressure, the unending meetings, and the feeling that everything was slipping out of his grasp had left him drained. So, when a colleague mentioned an old, forgotten campsite deep in Pine Ridge Forest, a place known for its peace and solitude, he didn't think twice. It seemed like the perfect place to escape, to recharge. The day he arrived, the forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The towering pines stood like silent sentinels, casting long shadows across the ground. There was no sound of wildlife, no rustle of the usual underbrush. It was as if the place had been forgotten by time itself. Jason set up his camp by a small clearing near a fire pit, the remnants of past campers still visible in the form of half-buried stones and charred logs. As night fell and the temperature dropped, he stoked the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle. For a moment, he let the warmth of the fire wash over him, a small comfort in the stillness of the woods. The crackling fire seemed to echo against the trees, giving the otherwise silent forest a voice. But then something shifted, a slight movement at the edge of his vision, so subtle that at first he thought it was just the wind. He turned his head, but nothing was there. He dismissed it as his imagination. The isolation was starting to get to him, that's all. The night deepened, and Jason settled into his sleeping bag by the fire, staring into the flames. Just as he was beginning to relax, he heard it. A faint rustling, soft and almost imperceptible. It came from behind him where the firelight barely reached. He twisted around but saw nothing. His heart started to beat a little faster. He stood up, looking around, but the clearing was still. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the fire continued to burn steadily. Maybe it was just an animal, a squirrel or a fox. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He sat back down, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease. The fire was too calming, too perfect. As long as it was burning, he figured he'd be safe. But the deeper into the night he went, the more the whispers grew. At first, they were so faint he thought he might have imagined them. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the snap of twigs underfoot. But then, just as he was nodding off, a voice broke through the silence. "It burns!" Jason jerked upright, his breath catching in his throat. He spun around, but there was nothing. The fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows across the ground. A light breeze stirred the trees, but it was all too quiet now. No birds, no animals, only the fire. His hands trembled as he stoked the embers, the crackling of the wood masking the faintest hint of something else. Whispers carried on the wind. "Help us!" Jason stood up abruptly, his pulse quickening. The voices were faint but persistent, each one seeming to rise from the darkness around him. His eyes flicked nervously to the fire, the warmth of the flames no longer comforting but unsettling. He took a step back, his feet dragging across the dirt as if something invisible were pulling him toward the fire. The wind picked up again, rustling the trees, and the whispers became clearer, more insistent. They weren't coming from the wind. They weren't coming from anywhere he could pinpoint. They were coming from the shadows, coming from the fire itself. "It burns!" The fire flickered, casting an eerie glow across the surrounding forest. Jason's mind raced, trying to reason with himself. It was just his imagination. The pressure of work, the stress of being alone. Everything had built up to this. But even as he tried to rationalize it, the whispers continued, rising in intensity. We must escape the flames." The voice was no longer a whisper, but a command, clear and powerful. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he realized that the voice wasn't coming from the wind, or the trees, or even the fire. It was coming from somewhere darker, deeper, like it was being whispered from within the earth itself. He took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. "We can't leave." He whirled around to face the fire, and for a split second he thought he saw something in the flames. A figure darker than the shadows around him, a shape that flickered like a reflection. Jason stumbled back, his hand reaching for his pack, but the whispering voices were louder now, rising in a cacophony of panic and despair. The warmth of the fire had become suffocating, like the air itself was closing in on him. "We burn again." Jason turned and fled, his heart hammering in his chest, a rush of panic flooding his every step. The voices, now a chorus of torment, grew louder, more frenzied, as though the forest itself had come alive with them. His feet pounded the dirt, the cold air biting at his skin, but the fire, its crackling heat, never left him. It pressed against his back like a suffocating, unseen hand, its warmth crawling beneath his clothes and searing his flesh. He could hear the snap of burning logs, echoing louder with each frantic step. He stumbled, his breath ragged, eyes wide in terror. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he pushed through the tangled underbrush, the fire stayed with him. It was a presence, an inescapable shadow that wrapped itself around his every move. The ground beneath him felt hotter now, as though the very earth was alight, burning through his shoes. The flames followed, swirling in the air behind him, like a relentless predator stalking its prey. The trees were no longer a shield. They loomed like dark figures, their branches twisting above him like skeletal fingers, reaching for him, the firelight casting long, twisted shadows across the forest floor. It was as if the night itself was alive, pulsating with the heat of the flames, as though the fire had seeped into the very fabric of the forest. Jason dared a glance over his shoulder, and what he saw made his blood run cold. In the distance, the fire still burned, but not as he remembered. It was larger now, an unholy glow stretching into the sky, a beacon in the darkness. The flames flickered in strange, unnatural shapes, almost as if they were reaching out for him, and amidst them, shadowy forms seemed to move, swirling within the fire like restless spirits trapped in an eternal dance. The heat became unbearable, the fire now suffocating his every breath. His throat closed up as though the smoke itself was choking him. His feet stumbled and he collapsed to his knees, his skin slick with sweat, even though the night air was cold. The fire was still there, always behind him, a living thing that wouldn't let him escape. And then he heard it, clearer than before, the unmistakable sound of crackling flames, growing louder, closer. But this time it wasn't just the fire, it was within him, a presence crawling inside his chest, pressing against his ribs. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, as if the fire had taken root inside his very body. Jason's vision blurred, the line between what was real and what was imagined fading. The woods were closing in on him. The fire was everywhere now, the heat scorching his face, the shadows distorting around him. The whispers, once faint and distant, now filled his ears, a maddening roar of voices. The flames burn. The forest had changed. The trees, the ground, the very air, all of it felt twisted, suffused with the relentless hunger of the flames. Jason could no longer tell which way he was heading. Every direction seemed to lead him back to the fire, back to that cursed campsite. The path was gone. The woods had become a labyrinth of shadows, and no matter how fast he ran, the fire was always there, just behind him, waiting. The fire's glow burned brighter in the distance, an eternal beacon in the night. And in the flickering light, Jason could see the outlines of figures, souls trapped in the flames, faces distorted with pain and anguish, their mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. They were reaching out to him, their twisted forms moving in rhythm with the crackling flames. Jason shrieked in terror as he was fully engulfed in the flames. It was too late. Jason awoke with a start, his face pressed against the ground. For a moment he was disoriented, the sounds of the forest around him too quiet, too still. The once flaring flames had dwindled, leaving behind a crackling bed of dying embers that hissed and popped. The crackling, the suffocating heat, it was all gone. He shot up, his heart still racing, a cold sweat soaking his shirt. His campsite lay before him, as if nothing had happened. Had it been a dream? No, it couldn't have been. The fear, the heat, it felt so real. His hands trembled as he wiped his forehead, looking around in a daze. The woods were silent, peaceful even, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. With a shaky breath, he began packing up his gear, his movements automatic, as though going through the motions of something familiar. He tried to shake off the lingering unease, telling himself it had to be a nightmare. He must have sat too near the fire and blacked out. Nothing more. He just needed to get out of there, get back to normal. Once he was packed, he stood, took one last look at the clearing, and then made his way back down the trail, the weight in his chest lightening with each step. The next day, back in the comfort of his apartment, Jason sat at his desk, trying to distract himself from the strange events of the night before. He needed to focus, so he began searching for information on the area, hoping to put his mind at ease. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he typed in the name of the forest. There were the usual articles about hiking, wildlife, and the occasional bear sighting. But then something caught his eye. A newspaper article from over a century ago. The headline read, "Tragic wildfire devastates village. Lives lost in blaze." Curious, he clicked on the link, his eyes scanning the text. The article detailed the horrific events of a fire that had consumed a small village near the forest, killing dozens of people, many of whom were never found. There were whispers of strange happenings before the fire, rumors of people hearing voices and seeing strange figures in the flames. According to the article, some claimed the fire had been caused by an ancient curse, a force bound to the land, unwilling to let go of those who had suffered. The article mentioned the fire had started in a place not far from his campsite, and the flames had burned for hours, unstoppable, as if the fire itself had a mind of its own. Jason's hand froze above the keyboard, his mind racing. The date of the fire was over 100 years ago. But the strange feelings, the burning heat, the whispers in the night, it all felt too real, too familiar. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen, a chill creeping down his spine. Was it just a dream? Or had he stumbled upon something that had been waiting for him, something that still lingered in the woods, waiting for the next soul to claim? The fire, the voices, had they really been a figment of his imagination, or had he become a part of a tragedy that was far older than he could comprehend? As the chill deepened in his bones, Jason knew one thing for certain. The fire was still out there somewhere, waiting.